This video is the extension opportunity for 5C. We are going to get started on page 197. A trip to the mountains. The hiking club is on a trip to hike up a mountain. The members increased their elevation 290 feet during their hike this morning. Now they are at an elevation of 450 feet. You are going to answer questions A, B, and C. Pause the video, try those out, and then come back when you are finished. First question is explain how to find their elevation before the hike. So they increased their elevation 290 feet, and now they are at an elevation of 450 feet. If it's now they are at 450 feet, I know that that is where they are equal to, that is where they are ending up. They increased their elevation, which means they added elevation of 290, and we need to figure out what they started with. I can work backwards by thinking about 450 take away 290 is going to give me what I started with. So 450 take away 290, 0 minus 0 is 0, 5 take away 9 we cannot do, so we borrow from the 4, make it a 3, it becomes 15. 15 take away 9 is 6, and 3 take away 2 is 100, or 1. So 160 plus 290 means they started at 160 feet. Han says the equation E plus 290 equals 450 describes the situation. What does the variable E represent? Well, I sort of just explained that. E is the start of their hike. Han says that he can rewrite his equation as E equals 450 plus negative 290 to solve for E. Compare Han's strategy to your strategy for finding the beginning elevation. If I look at my original strategy, I used subtraction, which even though it was subtraction and Han wrote plus negative 90, I know that I can say that adding a negative is the same as subtracting a positive. This answer might change based on whatever strategy you used at the top, but if I were to compare mine, adding a negative was the same as subtracting. Next, you are going to move on to number 2. The temperature fell 4 degrees in the last hour. Now it is 21 degrees. Write and solve an equation to find the temperature it was 1 hour ago. Please pause and do number 2, and then come back when you are finished. If the temperature fell 4 degrees in the last hour and it is now 21 degrees, I am missing what it started with. I can say it fell, or I took away, or I added a negative 4 degrees, and it is now 21 degrees. To figure out what that missing temperature was, I can reverse this and think about, I need to find what number, if I take away negative 4, so 21 take away the negative 4, would give me my question mark. So this is our rule for addition. If I have an addition problem, I can rewrite it essentially going backwards using subtraction. I know that subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive, so I'm going to rewrite this as 21 plus 4, which is 25. So their starting temperature was 25 degrees. Next one is number 3. I'm going to zoom out just a smidge so we can see it. There are 3 times as many students participating in the hiking trip this year than last year. There are 42 students on the trip this year. Explain how to find the number of students that came on the hiking trip last year. And then this is going to continue to letter B on the next page. Maya says that the equation 3s equals 42 describes the situation. What does the variable s represent? Maya says that she can rewrite her equation as s equals 1/3 times 42 to solve for s. Compare my strategy to your strategy for finding the number of students on last year's trip. You are going to complete number 3, A, B, and C. Please pause and then come back when you are finished. So how to find how many students there were on the last year trip. So there were 3 times as many students participating this year, and there are 42 on the trip this year. So I have to think about, if I'm working backwards, I would do 42 divided by 3, because this is the opposite of 3 times. So if I were to move on to the next page, Mai says the equation 3 times s equals 42 describes the situation. What does the s represent? The s, in this case, 3 times something, they're taking 3 times the students. So students are s. Mai says that she can rewrite her equation as s equals 1/3 times 42 to solve for s. Compare my strategy to your strategy for finding the number of students on last year's trip. Well, my strategy was dividing by 3, which we have talked about already. 1/3, or multiplying by 1/3, is the same as dividing by 3. And my writing it as 1/3 times 42, hers might even be a little bit easier because we can set up a fraction multiplication problem, which might be easier since we don't have our calculators. Next is number 4. The cost of the hiking trip this year is 2/3 of the cost of last year's trip. This year's trip costs $32. Write and solve an equation to find the cost of last year's trip. You're going to pause and come back when you are finished with number 4. So this year was 2/3. I'm going to use T. 2/3 of the trip was $32. So now I need to think about, I'm doing the opposite of this. So T is equal to 32 divided by 2/3, which, using our fraction rule of keep, change, flip, I can find last year's trip by taking 32 over 1 times 3 over 2, which 32 times 3 would be 96. 1 times 2 is 2, and 96 divided by 2 would be 48. So the trip last year was $48. Next one we are going to go to is page 200. So turn in your books to page 200. You are going to solve number 1. So you've got 5 different equations. You are going to solve each of those for the variable. So find out the value of the variable. Pause and come back when you are finished. So 2/5 times t, the opposite of this would mean, I'm going to write this up here, t equals 6 divided by 2/5, which, if we keep, change, flip, means we've got 6 over 1 times 5 over 2, which is 6 times 5 is 30, 1 times 2 is 2, and 30 divided by 2 would be 15. So t would be equal to 15. I can see here negative 4.5 is equal to a minus 8. Well, to find a, I need to do the opposite. So a equals negative 4.5 plus 8. I know I am adding more than my negative, so what I am adding to it is bigger, so it's going to bring me back to 0. So I'm actually going to figure out what 8 minus 4.5 is, and then just make it negative, which would be negative 3.5. 1/2 plus p equals negative 3. So p is going to be negative 3. Do the opposite of this positive or plus, which would be take away 1/2. Well, half, if I have a negative and I'm taking something away, I can rewrite this as p equals negative 3 plus a negative 1/2, which 2 negatives added together make a bigger negative, which would be negative 3 and 1/2. Next, I have 12 equals number times 3. The opposite of multiplying by 3 would mean x is 12 divided by 3, which means x is equal to 4. And then negative 12 equals negative 3 times y, which would mean y is equal to negative 12, the opposite of multiplying by negative 3, which is dividing by negative 3. which means y is equal to a negative divided by a negative is a positive, and 12 divided by 3 is 4. Next, you are going to move on to number 2. Match each equation to the step that will solve the equation. So you've got A, B, C, D, which are equations. You're going to match it up to 1, 2, 3. What would you do to actually solve it? Go ahead and pause, try the problem, and then come back when you're finished. 5 times x is equal to 0.4. Well, I need to do the opposite of multiplying by 5, which is dividing by 5, but I can see here all of these are multiplying options. So I have to think about what's the same as dividing by 5, which I know multiplying each side by a fifth would be the same. And since this was positive 5, I want to make sure I choose the option that is positive 1/5. X over 5, or x divided by 5, is equal to 8. The opposite of dividing by 5 would be multiplying by 5. So I'm going to make sure I choose number 1 since that has the positive 5. Next, I have a negative x divided by 5 equals 3. Since this has the negative, the opposite of dividing would be multiplying by negative 5. And then I've got 7 equals negative 5 times x. My last option, I'll just make sure that that works. The opposite of multiplying by negative 5 would be dividing by negative 5, which would be the same as multiplying each side by negative 1/5. Next, you are just going to slide over to page 201. Write an equation where a number is added to a variable and a solution is negative 8. And then write an equation where a number is multiplied by a variable and a solution is negative 4/5. Remember that a variable, we typically use letters, but it's just a symbol for what we don't know yet. Go ahead and pause, try the problem, and come back when you are finished. All right, so a number is added to a variable and the solution is negative 8. I know solution means what it is equal to, so equal to negative 8. A number is added to a variable, so I have a variable and I'm adding a number to it. You can put any number there. I am going to put 2. A number plus 2 equals negative 8. You could have put any number there. Write an equation where a number is multiplied by a variable and a solution is negative 4/5. So solution, it is equal to negative 4/5. A number is multiplied by a variable. So you could write it 2 different ways. You could have said like x times your number, so something like x times 3, or you could write it as 3x. This version here, the 3x, is what we typically see in algebra, so it is good to get in the process of writing your number in front of the variable, but saying x times something is also okay. But make sure when you're writing your multiplication, you're using the dot, because we don't want something like x, x, 3. That gets a little